Hey friends, tonight, let's explore the gentle, slightly awkward, and completely misunderstood story of a bird that never knew fear until it was too late. You're standing on the soft, leaf-strewn floor of a forest, unlike any you've known. The air is thick with humidity and the sweet scent of guava old bark and the occasional whiff of something very ripe. Birds call overhead, but their songs are relaxed leisurely, like they've got nowhere to be. Nothing here is in a rush, including the stout, round creature waddling through the underbrush just ahead of you. It looks like someone described a pigeon to a child, gave them a crayon, and then built the drawing out of soft pillows. You've just met your first dodo. Its feathers aren't sleek or impressive. They're more like worn-out dusters. Its wings are decorative at best, like the side mirrors on a medieval cart, technically present, but they won't save you from anything. The beak is curved slightly comical, like it's permanently surprised to find itself attached to this bird. And yet, there's something serene about it, like it's never been chased, never heard shouting, never even considered that danger might exist. It's the medieval equivalent of someone who's never read the news. That's because on the island of Mauritius, where this bird lives, there are no predators. None. No lions, no foxes, no bored cats with unresolved issues. Just a lot of lush foliage, slow-moving tortoises, and fruit that basically volunteers to fall from trees. For a few million years, the dodo lived a life of blissful ignorance, eating fruit, laying eggs in peaceful little nests, and walking wherever it pleased. It didn't need to fly so eventually. It just didn't. Flying became obsolete like chainmail for fish, and you wandering through this quiet green world can't help but feel a little envious. No natural enemies. No need to panic. The greatest risk in a dodo's day is tripping over a root or falling asleep too close to a sun-warmed rock. Even their bones suggest a life of ease, dense-grounded and unbothered. In a way, they were evolutionary success stories totally in sync with their environment. It just so happened their environment was unprepared for the age of exploration. Now let's take a step back, because here's the historical fact. For tonight, the dodo was not biologically inferior. It was simply too well adapted to a world that vanished overnight. When Dutch sailors arrived in Mauritius in the late 1500s, they didn't find a helpless bird. They found a bird that had no idea what a ship was, or why loud men in metal boots were poking around the trees with clubs and curious expressions. The poor dodo walked right up to them, like a greeter at a feathery hotel. And here's our quirky detail. Some of the earliest sailors thought the dodo looked drunk. Truly, their writings suggest it stumbled, swayed, and blinked a lot. Of course, these were men who'd been at sea for weeks, eating hardtack and arguing with rats, so reliability may be questionable. But it adds to the myth. The dodo wasn't just flightless, it was clueless. Which of course it wasn't. It simply didn't have a reason to suspect that a new species would show up and treat it like a snack, a specimen, or worse, comic relief in travel logs. And here's our first little academic squabble to lull you further into rest. Some historians argue that the dodo didn't actually go extinct due to hunting. At least not primarily. Instead, they point fingers at invasive species brought by humans, rats, pigs, monkeys that ate dodo eggs and competed for food. The theory suggests that humans weren't the direct villains, but the chaotic middle managers who brought the real culprits to the meeting. So picture this, a world where every sunrise was just another day of fruit moss and unhurried naps. where the loudest noise was a gecko sneezing, and the biggest drama was a coconut falling unexpectedly. You're standing under a breadfruit tree now. The leaves are huge, casting deep shadows that dance slightly with the breeze. You hear a rustle, and there it is again, the waddling ambassador of naivete. The dodo sees you. It tilts its head. Then very calmly, it walks over and begins pecking at your shoelaces. You're not a threat. Why would you be? Even now, knowing what you know, you feel oddly protective. Like someone needs to explain to this bird that the world has changed, that ships mean danger, and that curiosity is not always a safe hobby. But it wouldn't listen. It wouldn't understand. The dodo wasn't built for fear. It was built for balance, for peace, and possibly for becoming an overly literal metaphor in future bedtime history scripts. It waddles away again. Content, as if fate isn't preparing a surprise ending. And before you drift off, here are your 3 soft, sleepy chuckles. The dodo didn't fly, but it did walk with the confidence of someone who forgot to study, but showed up to the exam in a cape. Some naturalists in the 18th century tried to reassemble dodo skeletons and accidentally gave one 4 knees. A sailor once described the dodo's meat as tough and not worth the firewood, which is probably why it went extinct out of pure culinary embarrassment. The island with no predators. You wake up, or maybe you never fully fell asleep. Hard to tell in this place where the air feels like a warm exhale and time behaves like a very sleepy snail. You're lying beneath a broadleaf canopy that smells faintly of banana peels and gentle humidity. A soft buzzing hums in the distance, not threatening, just present like nature's version of a lullaby. This is Mauritius, but not the postcard version. Not the sugarcane plantations, not the colonial outposts, not the fancy resort with 17 kinds of rum. No, you're much earlier. Back when the island was still a whisper to the rest of the world. A green dot in the middle of the Indian Ocean that most maps didn't even bother naming. A place that floated untouched for millions of years. A place so quiet, the only thing that evolved sharp teeth were plants. The island's residents are a who's who of evolution's chillest experiments. Giant tortoises that move like dreams, fruit bats with wings like velvet blankets, slow-moving snails the size of teacups. And of course, the dodo strutting along like it's late to a picnic, but still not worried about it. The thing is, this island had no predators. Not one. No wolves, no hawks, not even a weasel with a bad attitude. And without predators, something curious happens. Evolution stops investing in things like claws, flight speed. Why run when nothing chases? Why hide when nothing lurks? Everything here is soft. Round, brightly colored, in that way that says, I've never been hunted, and it shows. And that includes the dodo. Its wings, once built for flight, shrank. Its bones thickened. It waddled into a lifestyle best described as fruit enthusiast meets moss philosopher. If the island were a medieval court, the dodo would be the sleepy noble in the corner, holding a pear and thinking deep snack-based thoughts. Tonight's historical fact, gently drifting in with the ocean breeze, is this Mauritius was one of the last discovered islands on Earth to host large flightless birds living in complete ecological isolation. It was like nature's little experiment in what happens when no one's watching or hunting. And the result? Peace. An awkward, fluffy, fruit-scented peace. But here's where things get weird in the best way, of course. You turn your head and spot a tree whose roots look like they're doing a slow medieval dance. Beneath it is a tortoise half buried in the soil, looking like a rock that gave up pretending. A bird the size of a small cat hops onto its shell. Not to peck, not to scold, just to sit. There's a shared understanding here. Nothing's in a hurry. Nothing's trying to eat anything. This is the spa version of a food chain. And here comes our peculiar little detail. For the evening, the dodo may have evolved a communal nesting behavior with multiple birds laying eggs in close proximity, like a sleepy egg village. The theory comes from historical sketches showing groups of dodos lounging near clusters of eggs, as if babysitting was more of a group project than a personal burden. Imagine a nursery school, except every child is an egg, and every parent has a beak and a wobble. Of course, the lack of predators made this possible. You don't need to hide your kids when no one's plotting to poach them. But as you're probably sensing, this worked until it didn't. Because this paradise came with a big blind spot, it assumed tomorrow would be like today. Now let's ease into tonight's scholarly pillow fight. Some researchers argue that isolation didn't just make island species vulnerable, it made them oblivious. Unlike mainland animals that adapted to constant change, these island dwellers hadn't updated their threat detection software in millennia. The dodo wasn't dumb. It was unbriefed. It lived in a world where the worst thing that could happen was running out of ripe fruit. So when humans showed up, noisy, hungry, fond of fire, it wasn't terror that kicked in. It was curiosity. You hear it now, a crunching sound in the brush. Not alarming, just new. The dodo next to you tilts its head. It waddles toward the noise, like someone checking if the bakery reopened early. No panic. No instinct to hide. Just the sweet, doomed curiosity of a species that evolved in a world too kind to prepare it. And as you watch it, disappears into the undergrowth, following the scent of something unfamiliar. You lie back, the forest, breathing slowly around you. Overhead, a canopy of green filters the moonlight into soft dapples. A fruit drops beside you with a gentle plop, as if the tree is offering a midnight snack. You think about what it would be like to live in a world with no fear. A world where danger is a foreign concept and strangers are just potential snack partners. It's a lovely thought, and a fragile one. And just before your mind floats off entirely, let's tuck in our 3 sleepy smiles for the night. The dodo's biggest concern used to be rain, because soggy feathers really messed with its swagger. Some tortoises on the island live so long, they might have watched the dodo show up and vanish. A 17th century sailor wrote that dodos would walk into campfires if fruit was roasting, making them the only known birds who possibly invented marshmallow-scented tragedy. A bird that forgot to fly. You're on a gentle slope now, where the ferns grow thick and the soil gives slightly under your feet, like it's been resting just as much as you. The air is warm, still sticky sweet, with the scent of overripe mango and fallen guava. Somewhere behind you, a distant dodo lets out a honk that can only be described as deeply unbothered. It echoes through the forest like a sleepy yawn. No urgency, just existing. Tonight, we're walking alongside one of nature's oddest ironies, a bird that evolved to fly, then chose not to. There's a saying among medieval knights that armor becomes your burden if you never enter battle. For the dodo wings were the armor, and Mauritius A, land with no battles, no chase scenes, no desperate swoops into the sky. So slowly, quietly, over generations, those wings became nothing more than decorative shoulder pads, a nod to ancestry, a whisper from the past. You pause beside a bush, with flowers shaped like tiny bells. A dodo emerges on the other side, round-feathered and proudly grounded. It shakes itself, ruffling feathers that seem more ornamental than practical, and pecks at the earth with a concentration usually reserved for scholars. The fact is, dodos descended from pigeons, flying ones, probably strong storm-braving types who crossed open ocean centuries before GPS or coconut-based motivation. At some point, one group crash-landed on Mauritius, looked around, and collectively thought, "This'll do." And who can blame them? No hawks, no snakes, just gentle trees, bugs that couldn't be bothered to bite, and enough fruit to cause a blood sugar spike in anything with a digestive tract. In such comfort, flying was excessive. Think of it like medieval nobles giving up swordsmanship once they discovered embroidery and cheese. Here's where our curious side note glides. And scientists believe that within a few thousand years, the dodo lost not just its flight muscles, but also part of the brain structure that managed aerial balance. In short, it didn't just stop flying, it forgot how. The neural blueprint was erased, like deleting a folder labeled emergency exits because, hey, there haven't been any fires. And now comes tonight's gentle debate to snooze beside, did the dodo become flightless because of environmental safety, or because evolution left unchecked defaults to laziness? Some argue that natural selection doesn't always reward the strongest, but rather the most efficient. If flying costs too many calories and isn't needed, the body cuts it like a budget meeting without coffee. Others argue that such traits aren't selected for or against. They simply drift unchallenged like a nap with no alarm. You watch as your dodo companion waddles over a log, not elegantly, but with the quiet confidence of someone who's never been late to anything in their life. It reaches a patch of berries, tilts its head thoughtfully, and begins plucking the fruit one by one. No flapping, no hopping, just grounded snacking. And you realize something: flightlessness isn't failure, it's commitment. The dodo committed to the ground. It chose to belong entirely to one place, one pace, one way of being. It became the very symbol of "I'm good right here, thanks." But unfortunately, that meant it also became uniquely unprepared for sudden change. You sit beside a large stone that's still warm from the sun. The dodo looks at you, then sits too, if you can call that squat wobble a sit. You both rest in that easy silence that only exists between creatures who expect no danger, no demands. The forest hums gently. Leaves shift. A gecko chirps and immediately regrets how energetic that sounded. And right here, in this moment, you can almost believe the bird never needed wings in the first place. Not when it had balance, simplicity, a world that welcomed it exactly as it was. Just before you drift off again, let's send you into sleep with 3 final puffs of dodo delight. Some early naturalists tried to teach captive dodos to fly by throwing them gently, and then blamed the dodos when they just gave up halfway through the air. One theory suggests dodos use their little wings for balance when running, like very enthusiastic elbows. If you try to flap your arms while eating a pear, you'll look remarkably like a dodo mid-lunch. Bonus points if you do it in slippers. Chubby, flightless, and fine with it. You're moving through a clearing now, one that's sun-drenched and quiet, save for the occasional thunk of fruit hitting earth, like a lazy drummer keeping time. The grass is soft and uneven underfoot, dotted with mushrooms and leaves shaped like flattened violins. Ahead, in the dappled light, a plump figure bobs its way through the underbrush, round serene and completely unhurried. that friend is your dodo. And tonight, you're following one of evolution's most underrated icons of self-acceptance. A bird who didn't care about flying, didn't stress about cardio, and definitely didn't count calories. Chubby, flightless, and perfectly content with its place in the universe. Now, before we go further, let's deflate one modern myth. Like an overbaked meat pie, the dodo was not morbidly obese. It didn't waddle around huffing and puffing like a feathered pastry about to pop. In fact, many early illustrations showing the dodo as impossibly rotund came from stuffed museum specimens, taxidermy attempts made by people who'd never actually seen a living dodo. Think artistic license meets medieval marshmallow man. The real dodo, big-boned, yes. Sturdy. Muscular in a built-for-lounging and foraging kind of way. But not the waddling balloon people imagine. More like the linebacker of island birds, if linebackers ate fallen figs and had zero concept of sports. Tonight's historical fact to hum you into calmness. Contemporary accounts suggest the dodo's size changed seasonally. During times of plenty, they'd bulk up storing fat, the way modern humans store guilt about not using gym memberships. During lean months, they'd slim down a bit, like nature's version of medieval fashion tunic, or doublet, depending on the weather. You're crouched near a shallow pond now. The water is still clear enough to reflect the clouds drifting overhead, like absent-minded daydreams. Your dodo waddles to the edge, stares at its own reflection, then takes a delicate sip. It doesn't rush. It doesn't panic. It doesn't seem even mildly embarrassed that a feather is stuck to its beak. And you realize this bird radiates something few medieval creatures ever got to feel bodily confidence. No one ever told the dodo it was too heavy to matter. No one suggested wing day at the gym. It didn't hide in the bushes muttering about metabolism. It lived as it was shaped by fruit adapted to peace and wholly disinterested in medieval beauty standards, which, considering those standards, involved powdered wigs and tight hose, might have been for the best. Let's bring in tonight's quirky side note. Some naturalists now believe the dodo's thick legs weren't just for waddling. They were strong enough for short bursts of surprising speed. That's right, our chunky friend, possibly capable of a quick jog when motivated, like sprinting to beat another dodo to a particularly juicy papaya, or moving urgently away from an inquisitive goat. Which leads us softly to tonight's scholarly squabble. Was the dodo actually sluggish, or just underobserved? Many early reports claimed the dodo was clumsy and slow, but some researchers argue that these were observations of birds kept in captivity, stressed underfed, or simply bewildered by the sudden arrival of humans and their strange hat-based culture. Wild dodos, in their natural habitat, might have moved with more grace, or at least more purpose. You look back at your feathered guide. It's plopped itself into a patch of moss like it's claiming a throne, its eyes half closed. One leg stretches out to the side in a move that says unapologetically, I am exactly as I should be. It's not trying to fly, not trying to flee, not trying to be anything but soft, round, and vaguely melon-shaped. And honestly, that's inspiring. So you sit beside it. The earth is warm. The breeze carries the scent of crushed leaves and possibility. And for a brief moment, you too forget about all the places you're supposed to be, all the things you're supposed to improve. You are exactly as you are, with a chubby, flightless bird who never once doubted its design. As sleep sidles closer, giggling quietly in the bushes, here are your 3 dodo chuckles to carry you over. Early sailors mistook the dodo's roundness for pregnancy leading to at least one very awkward field sketch labeled Mother Dodo with 20 eggs nearby, none of which were hers. A 17th century poet described the dodo as a plump monk in bird form, which is oddly accurate and oddly flattering. There's no record of a dodo ever panicking, even when confronted by musket fire, which means either deep composure or really slow processing. European boots and coconut shells. You're crouched behind a bush. Now don't worry, it's soft, leafy, and smells faintly of toasted coconut. Through the fronds, you spot the shoreline where the first longboats have arrived. The ocean glints in that overly bright, something's about to change kind of way. The waves are gentle, but the boots stepping onto the sand, not so much. Thick leather and deeply confused by sand. Tonight, you're witnessing the moment when two wildly different worlds bump into each other like sleepwalkers at opposite ends of a hallway. One side has feathers and fruit, the other beards and muskets. European sailors, mostly Dutch in this particular chapter, have just discovered Mauritius. And like many first-time tourists, they have no chill. They clamber up the beach, loud and sunburnt, dragging barrels, goats, and a vague sense of superiority. One of them pauses to poke at a coconut with his boot. Another picks it up, shakes it, and pretends to listen like it's a message in a bottle. A third sees movement in the trees, and it begins. Because here comes the dodo. Curious, wobbling, gently unaware that it's about to become famous for all the wrong reasons. Tonight's historical fact: the first recorded encounter between humans and the dodo occurred in 1598, when a Dutch fleet led by Admiral Wybrand van Warwijk landed on Mauritius. They weren't here for birds. They were here for water rest and maybe some easy meat. But they found the dodo. And the dodo adorably, tragically found them kind of interesting. Picture it. A group of men with rusty armor, questionable hygiene, and probably some digestive issues, suddenly surrounded by fat birds that walked right up to them. No pecking, no flapping, just interested head tilts and the occasional honk. Here's our strange detail. Of the night, early sailors reported that dodos were easy to catch, but not particularly tasty. Some called the meat tough. Others said it was oily. One brave soul even described it as like eating rope soaked in old butter. It didn't help that they had better options, like the giant tortoises, which were basically walking lunchboxes that could survive months on a ship without refrigeration. Still, the dodo's real downfall wasn't being eaten, it was being noticed. Once humans started building temporary camps, they brought with them rats, pigs, and monkeys, none of which were invited by the dodos. These animals raided nests, cracked eggs, and disrupted the entire sleepy rhythm of island life. You move through the trees, now watching the newcomers set up camp. Barrels thud into the sand. Fires crackle. A man in a bright red sash gestures at a dodo with a coconut shell like he's trying to start a conversation. The dodo blinks slowly, possibly wondering if this is a new fruit. And now, we drift gently into tonight's academic cloud pillow fight. Did early European reports exaggerate the dodo's docility to excuse its treatment? Some scholars argue that labeling the bird as stupid or lazy helped sailors feel less guilty about capturing, killing, or shipping it off to Europe as a curiosity. Others believe the reports were fairly accurate. Dodos genuinely had no reason to fear anything that walked on two legs. Until suddenly, they did. You watch as another sailor tries to herd two dodos into a makeshift pen using a broom. He's not very good at it. The dodos walk in out, and then one just sits down, apparently bored with the entire interaction. The sailor throws up his hands and mutters something that sounds like an insult, but mostly smells like regret. And you begin to feel it, that shift. The island is still beautiful. The fruit still drops. But the tone has changed. There's a new rhythm now. Boots on sand. Muskets leaning against trees. Coconut shells being used for things they were never meant to hold: gunpowder, wine, personal ambition. You sit by a tree, the bark warm from the sun, and you see a dodo watching the humans. Not scared, just puzzled. It tilts its head, blinks, takes a step forward. Curiosity has never been so quiet, or so final. And before your thoughts drift into the blue-black softness of night, here are your three closing giggles. One sailor reportedly tried to train a dodo to follow him by tying fruit to his belt. It worked until the dodo bit through the rope and walked off with the entire belt. There are genuine 17th century sketches showing dodos wearing tiny sailor hats. No one knows why. We can only assume alcohol was involved. A ship's log once described a dodo as the dumbest guard bird we've ever seen, which makes you wonder what that sailor's definition of guard really was. Naming a bird after its sound. You're sitting now on a smooth rock overlooking a clearing where the dodos roam peck and occasionally bump into things that weren't technically in their way. The light is soft, filtered through a haze of tree pollen, and the kind of golden sunlight that makes everything feel slightly enchanted, even if someone in the distance just dropped a coconut on their foot and swore in 3 languages. A dodo waddles past you, lets out a soft, warbling grunt that sounds somewhere between a sneeze and a hiccup, and keeps going, like it didn't just redefine what bird calls could be. Tonight's story centers on something surprisingly slippery: the name dodo. That charming, slightly ridiculous label we've attached to this bird for centuries may sound like a children's rhyme, but it turns out it's more complicated than that. Like trying to explain to a medieval monk why beep is a word, the most widely accepted theory. The name dodo comes from the Portuguese word dudo, or doido, meaning foolish or simpleton. Not very flattering, to be honest. It's like naming a panda clumsy mess, or calling a koala leaf idiot. But that's how early sailors apparently saw the dodo slow unafraid, and just a little too trusting. Others claim the name came from the sound the bird made: a low, nasal, doo-doo grunt that might have charmed or annoyed sailors enough to write it down in their journals. There's no audio recording, obviously, but some written descriptions hint that the dodo's voice sounded like a snore wearing a bow tie, which honestly tracks. Now for tonight's peculiar detail. There may have been multiple local names for the dodo before dodo stuck. Some Dutch records refer to it as walgvogel, literally disgusting bird, not because it smelled bad or insulted anyone's shoes, but because some sailors found its meat unpleasant. Imagine being defined for eternity by one bad dinner review. But despite the name's muddled origins, dodo took hold. Simple, catchy, slightly silly, just like the bird. And like many things in history, the name outlived the creature it was meant to describe. You watch as another dodo waddles toward a fallen mango, pecks at it, once then pecks at a nearby rock, then returns to the mango like it had to check its options. It lets out that honking grunt again. If that's the sound early sailors heard echoing through the forest, you can kind of understand the temptation. It's not musical, it's not majestic, it's deeply relatable. And that brings us to tonight's academic pillow scuffle. Was the dodo name a form of colonial mockery, or a genuine attempt to capture something charmingly odd? Some scholars argue that naming the bird dodo reinforced the idea that it was laughable and therefore expendable. Others say the name was affectionate, a goofy label for a creature that didn't fit anyone's expectations but charmed them anyway. You lean back against a tree. The bark is rough, but warm. A gentle breeze shakes the leaves overhead, and somewhere nearby, a group of sailors are trying and failing to teach a dodo to play fetch using a stick. The bird stares blankly, then sits down. It's a wordless moment that says quite clearly, no. And that's the beauty of it. The dodo never asked for a name. It didn't seek legacy. It just existed, loud, lumpy, and unbothered. Humans showed up, tried to fit it into their stories, gave it a name that may or may not have been an insult, and carried on. But the bird remained exactly as it was, soft, strange, and deeply itself. As you fade gently toward dreams, here are tonight's 3 chuckle-soft closing thoughts. One sailor's journal described the dodo's cry as like a broken bell inside a barrel, which might explain why no dodo ever got a record deal. A Dutch officer once insisted that dodos could mimic human speech. No one believed him, probably because he also claimed his goat was fluent in Latin. If you say dodo 10 times slowly while blinking, you'll start to feel like the bird is naming you, which frankly seems fair. The great culinary mistake. You're near a smoky camp now. The scent in the air is complicated. A little bit of firewood, a touch of tropical rain, and something distinctly overcooked, like someone tried to roast a boot and accidentally invented jerky for people who've never known joy. This is the era where curiosity meets appetite, and unfortunately for the dodo, it does so over an open flame. Tonight's tale eases gently into the simmering pot of historical misjudgment, the belief that the dodo was hunted to extinction because it was delicious. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. In fact, if anything, the poor dodo might be one of the first animals to be eaten out of boredom, not taste. Let's lean into tonight's historical fact. Multiple journals from the 1600s describe dodo meat as tough, stringy, not worth the firewood, and my personal favorite like badly dried turtle wearing shoes. And yet, they kept eating it. Why? Because it didn't run away. Because it was there. Because when you've been on a ship eating pickled cabbage and questionable fish paste for 3 months, anything that doesn't look actively poisonous becomes a gourmet adventure. You peek into the clearing and spot 2 sailors poking at a bird roasting over a fire. One sniffs, the other grimaces. A third casually walks away, probably to go gnaw on a more cooperative coconut. Meanwhile, a few dodos stroll past completely unconcerned. Maybe they've already figured it out. Humans have the attention span of squirrels and the taste buds of confusion. One dodo stops to peck at a pot lid. It honks, clearly unimpressed. Here's your peculiar detail for tonight. While the dodo was occasionally eaten, many sailors preferred the island's giant tortoises, which were easier to store and frankly more palatable. Some ships reportedly loaded hundreds of tortoises at once, like a living pantry that didn't bite. So in this culinary contest, the dodo wasn't even the star. It was more like the weird dish someone brought to the feast that no one wanted to offend by refusing. Which brings us gently to tonight's scholarly stew of disagreement. Did humans actually eat enough dodos to cause their extinction? Or was the damage done mostly by animals we brought with us? Many modern researchers lean toward the latter. Rats and pigs, introduced by accident or indifference, raided dodo nests relentlessly. Dodos laid just one egg at a time. A single monkey with a sweet tooth could wipe out an entire generation before breakfast. But in popular history, the story of humans ate the dodo into oblivion stuck because it's dramatic, because it's simpler, because frankly, it sounds like something we would do. You shift your gaze toward the fire again. A sailor bites into a drumstick, chews twice, then tosses it aside with a grimace. A goat wanders over and sniffs it, then leaves, which tells you everything you need to know. The dodo across the path watches the whole scene with that classic dodo expression, blank interest. It looks, it blinks. It continues on its way, probably in search of something more edible than itself. Which, to be fair, is a long list. You're lying back now, on a bed of soft moss that feels like someone gently spilled a basket of forest pillows. The air is thick with the perfume of green things and faintly disappointed spices. Around you, the island carries on. Birds chirp, trees sway, and somewhere, a dodo honks from behind a rock, as if to say, you're cooking it wrong. And now drifting toward dreams here are tonight's gently roasted chuckles. A ship's log from 1602 listed 4 barrels of biscuits, 3 barrels of wine, and 1 live dodo for emergency snacking. Guess which one survived the trip? Hint it wasn't the biscuits. A French cook reportedly declared the dodo unroastable, which may explain why French cuisine quietly pretends the bird never existed. Early sailors sometimes complained that dodo meat tasted like unwashed mutton. This raises the question, who was washing their mutton in the first place? The first tourism mascot. You've wandered now to the edge of a sandy trail where the trees give way to a clearing that smells like damp rope-old parchment and someone's attempt at soup that mostly involved seawater and optimism. The sun casts long shadows across the worn footpath, and in the middle of it stands a dodo perfectly posed. It isn't doing much, just existing, with intent staring slightly left of center, like it's waiting for a portrait that no one's asked it to pose for. And tonight, you'll discover how this plump bird, flightless, snack-resistant, and entirely indifferent, accidentally became the first unofficial mascot of European ecotourism. Let's not forget, back in the early 1600s, places like Mauritius were still the medieval version of off the beaten path. No one came here for luxury. They came for water repairs, and if you were lucky, a mango that didn't hit you on the head. Yet when sailors and naturalists stumbled across the dodo, something strange happened. They didn't just observe it. They wrote about it, sketched it, talked about it endlessly in letters and journals. It was like discovering a local celebrity that hadn't yet realized it was famous. Here's tonight's historical truth, feathered in with a smile. Many early records describe the dodo not as food, but as entertainment. Sailors would gather around them, toss bits of fruit, laugh at their confused honking, and sometimes just sit beside them in awkward but oddly peaceful silence. You're watching that happen now. A group of explorers in mismatched breeches and sunburnt necks have taken a break by a grove of palm trees. One of them, probably named something like John, or Peter, or possibly regretful, holds up a sketch pad. The dodo in front of him tilts its head. He tilts his head back. It's a moment of pure mutual misunderstanding. Another sailor tries to feed the dodo a piece of salted fish. The dodo declines, politely. by walking away and sitting on someone's boot. Now for your odd detail of the night. Some ship's logs mention bringing dodos on board, not for food, but for display. A traveling curiosity, a feathered companion for the long voyage, something to impress friends with back in Europe. Unfortunately, these dodos rarely survived the trip, not because of violence, but because no one knew what to feed them. They were treated like living souvenirs, more mascot than meal. This brings us to our scholarly debate of the evening. Did the dodo become extinct, in part because it became too visible? Some historians argue that being famous actually accelerated the bird's downfall. Every traveler who met a dodo wrote about it, drew it, tried to bring one home. Its oddness made it interesting, and its friendliness made it easy. Easy to approach, easy to cage, easy to lose. You lean against a palm tree. Its trunk is cool to the touch, slightly rough, and dotted with beetle trails like ancient carved runes. The dodo beside you pecks gently at a fallen coconut, decides it isn't worth the effort, and flops down onto the sand with a sound like a resigned cushion. In a world before photography, the dodo became famous by word of mouth and hand-drawn drama. Each retelling exaggerated something: the belly, the beak, the vacant stare. It became a character before anyone truly understood the species. And like many mascots, it was loved, but not protected, which is a lesson in how attention doesn't always equal care. The sailors are packing up now. One of them ties a bright ribbon around the dodo's neck and declares it the king of the island, which the dodo responds to by falling asleep mid-squat. Another sketches the scene: a bird, a ribbon, a crown made from palm leaves, and a caption that reads something suspiciously poetic. You watch as the dodo snores softly through its reign, and now, as your eyes drift closed with the weight of evening, here are your 3 gently giggling footnotes. A board ship officer once taught a dodo to salute by lifting its foot, though there's no record the dodo cared in the slightest. One traveler nicknamed a particularly plump Dodo Madam Butterball, and then proceeded to write an entire poem about her unrequited love for a barrel of limes. At least one dodo was reportedly given a pirate hat and paraded around as a ship's honorary quartermaster. It mostly stood in a bucket and stared at ropes. The diary. Entries of confusion. You're flipping through the pages of a weathered old journal. Now no need to worry. The ink isn't haunted and the pages don't bite. They just crinkle softly with age, like they've spent a few centuries gossiping with the breeze. Around you, the jungle rustles politely, and a dodo strolls past holding a leaf in its beak, like it's just been assigned a role in a play it didn't audition for. Tonight's tale drifts softly through the written chaos, left by confused explorers, amateur naturalists, and one deeply poetic Dutch officer who maybe took too many coconuts to the head. Because here's your historical fact. Wrapped in ink stains and puzzled sketches, the dodo was one of the most misdescribed animals in early modern records. And the reason nobody could agree on what they were looking at. One sailor described the bird as a kind of penguin with the face of a duck and the heart of a cabbage. Another claimed it was related to ostriches, but only shorter, rounder, and more likely to fall over if startled. A third, possibly sleep-deprived, drew a dodo with wings the size of dinner plates, eyebrows, and an actual smile. You're sitting by a half-broken crate now, maybe one that once held ginger, or ship biscuits, or someone's career as a credible zoologist. Beside you lies a stack of parchment. One page reads, "The bird appears incapable of flight or intelligent thought, but is charming in the way of certain well-fed cats." Another describes the dodo as fond of music, though no one ever followed up on what kind of music. Lute ballads, sea shanties, dramatic harp solos. Let's glide into tonight's odd historical detail. Some journals confuse the dodo with multiple animals in a single paragraph. It wasn't just a large bird. It was a turtle-bird hybrid, or a walking gourd, with legs, or my favorite, a feathered child in mourning. One particularly dramatic entry, found in a crumbling logbook from 1601, claimed that the bird spoke with its eyes, carried its sadness like a saint, and refused fruit it did not personally pick. Scholars believe the author was either deeply emotional or confusing the dodo with a crew member named Franz. And now we settle into tonight's quiet scholarly tug of quill. Did the inconsistent early descriptions of the dodo make it harder to preserve or protect the species? Some argue that the confusion meant scientists didn't take the dodo seriously. If you can't define a thing, how can you defend it? Others suggest that the mystery added to its allure, making it a kind of natural world celebrity, too odd to ignore, but never really understood. You peer over the edge of a journal page. There's a sketch of a dodo in a bonnet. Another of it, balancing on a rock like a sleepy gymnast. And then one more lovingly detailed, but with 6 toes and a tail. The artist signed it proudly, as if to say, this is probably accurate, but also maybe not. Across the path, a real dodo stretches its legs, yawns, or sneezes, it's hard to tell, and then proceeds to peck gently at a fallen flower. It's not interested in accuracy. It's interested in lunch. And perhaps that's the heart of the matter. The dodo never needed to make sense to humans. It lived without explaining itself. It didn't try to be noble, or fierce, or wise. It just existed. And humans desperate for metaphors and meaning turned it into whatever suited the day's journal entry. As night thickens around you, like velvet soaked in ink, here are your 3 scribbled smiles for the dream journey ahead. A confused taxonomist once listed the dodo under mythical birds next to the phoenix and something called the sky goose. It took 12 years and a lot of shouting to fix that. One English sailor claimed the dodo could dance. Later footnotes suggest the sailor may have been drunk or trying to impress it. A preserved sketch of a dodo once appeared in a cookbook margin, possibly as a joke. The recipe on the page, how to boil a rock. Accidental extinction. Planning. You're sitting beneath a tree, now one of those wide, shady ones with bark that smells faintly of warm resin moss, and the kind of wisdom that probably shouldn't be ignored. The air carries the scent of burnt wood, crushed ferns, and unintended consequences. Nearby, a dodo is inspecting a boot left behind by a sailor. It pecks once, twice, then sits on it like it's claimed a throne made entirely of confusion. Tonight's chapter whispers its way into your ears with a soft and tragic irony. The dodo didn't go extinct because of some grand evil plan. It vanished mostly because nobody was planning anything at all. Let's start with tonight's historical fact, tucked neatly between half-burnt logs and carelessness. The extinction of the dodo was not the result of an organized hunting campaign, but rather a cascade of small, indifferent actions. No royal decree. No mass slaughter. Just a long string of mild decisions with dramatic consequences. You watch now as a crew of sailors unload supplies from a longboat. Barrels, crates, goats. Always goats. If there's one thing Europeans loved to bring with them during the age of exploration, it was livestock and rodents, that didn't understand boundaries. And here comes tonight's strange detail, trotting along beside a barrel of salted fish pigs. Not wild, majestic pigs, but chubby, unapologetic root-sniffing pigs that immediately begin investigating every rock and bush for something edible. And what do pigs love? Eggs, especially the ones that just sit there unguarded in shallow nests. That's what the dodo's up against. Not a sword, not a trap, but a pig with no idea it's rewriting the food chain. Rats, too. Brought aboard in sacks of grain or crates of boots they scattered into the forest like living punctuation marks. Their mission? None. Their effect? Profound. Dodo eggs laid just one at a time didn't stand a chance against these New Island interlopers. A generation could be lost overnight, quietly, without anyone noticing until it was far too late. And here comes tonight's gentle, scholarly disagreement, wrapped in moss and maybe a little guilt. Should we blame early humans for the dodo's extinction if they didn't fully understand the impact of their actions? Some argue that ignorance is no excuse. Others point out that 17th century sailors weren't ecologists. They were just trying not to die of scurvy. The dodo wasn't targeted. It was simply overlooked until it was gone. You shift on your patch of grass. It's soft, springy, and smells like damp rain clouds. A dodo waddles past, dragging a vine behind it, like it's trying to start a very gentle tug-of-war with the earth. It pauses, sniffs the air, and continues walking in a direction that probably doesn't lead anywhere specific. It's hard not to feel something, sadness maybe, or frustration, or that slow creeping ache you get when someone tells you the last page of the story was lost in a drawer centuries ago. Because that's what the dodo's extinction feels like, a slow fade, not a dramatic finale. A light that dimmed while everyone was looking somewhere else. And it didn't happen in a day. It happened over decades. Each egg eaten, each nest trampled, each new ship bringing more chaos in crates. There were sightings, fewer and fewer, until one day there weren't. Just old sketches, scattered bones, and people pointing to blank spaces in journals saying we should have known. You hear the wind shift. The leaves above rustle in agreement. A single feather floats down beside you, gray, soft, slightly frayed at the tip, like a bookmark from a chapter no one finished. And as you begin to drift into your own soft fade, here are your 3 sleepy sighs of quiet laughter. One colonial officer proposed building fences around dodo nests to protect them, but then got distracted by an argument about pineapple taxation and forgot. A pig once followed a dodo for half a day, not to hunt it, but because it liked the sound the dodo made while chewing. The last recorded plan to study the dodo involved a man with a notebook, a broken compass, and a tendency to nap under palm trees. No data was ever recovered. Rats, pigs, and other invaders. You're walking along a narrow trail, now soft dirt beneath your feet, the kind that remembers every step. The forest leans in gently from all sides, branches brushing your shoulders like sleepy greetings. Somewhere nearby, there's the unmistakable sound of a pig snorting, and a dodo making a quiet honk of disapproval. It's the medieval version of a neighborhood disagreement. Tonight's story comes wrapped in fur hooves and tiny twitching noses, because while the humans who landed on Mauritius might have had other things on their minds, navigation supplies impressing the captain with exotic souvenirs, they brought with them a cast of animal companions who would play devastating supporting roles in the dodo's quiet exit. Here's your historical fact, softly trotting into the clearing. The real destruction of the dodo wasn't done by humans directly, but by the invasive animals they unintentionally unleashed on the island. Specifically, pigs, rats, monkeys, and yes, even cats. It's a story less about malice and more about unintended chaos. You pause by a fallen log. It's hollow moss covered and currently occupied by 3 rats, having a midnight meeting over a half-eaten mango. They look at you. You look at them. They blink. You blink. They resume chewing. Let's talk pigs first. Not the storybook kind that build houses or wear bonnets. These were ship pigs, hardy, hungry, and very good at finding things buried under a thin layer of leaves. Things like dodo eggs, which were usually laid one at a time, unprotected in shallow ground nests. To a pig, that's not a tragedy. That's breakfast. Then there were rats who stowed away on ships like tiny pirates with better sneaking skills. Rats don't ask permission. They don't wait. They just multiply, explore, and eat. Eggs, hatchlings, fruit stores, even bark. A single pregnant rat could lead to hundreds of new rats within weeks. And if you were a dodo chick, that was the last surprise party you'd ever attend. And the monkeys. Oh, the monkeys. Introduced later by settlers, either as pets or by accident, they quickly adapted. Clever, fast, and more curious than respectful, they'd raid nests for fun. Not even for food sometimes. Just because they could. And now, here comes tonight's peculiar little fact. Some early settlers blamed the dodo's disappearance on witches and air spirits because they couldn't believe a bird so abundant could vanish so quickly. In a way, they weren't wrong. It was magic, just not the nice kind. It was the dark alchemy of imbalance, where an ecosystem built on peace met a boarding party of chaos. You're sitting now near a cluster of ferns. A dodo appears round, waddling blissfully unaware. It pecks at a low-hanging fruit, then glances at you like it's trying to remember if you're important. Behind it, a rustle. A pig. The dodo doesn't react. It's not built for fear. It's built for another time. Which leads us into tonight's scholarly stir. Should the dodo's extinction be viewed as a failure of evolution or a failure of human stewardship? Some argue that any species unable to adapt to new predators is simply unfit. Others say that's blaming the candle for not surviving the flood. The dodo evolved in a paradise humans turned it into a battlefield. You lie back in the grass, warm and soft like a mossy sigh. Overhead, the stars peek between branches. The pig snorts again, closer this time, but the dodo doesn't flinch. It keeps eating softly, honking, unaware that it's part of a vanishing act. And here, wrapped in fern scent, and the last chirps of night birds, are your 3 drowsy chuckles. One settler claimed his chickens were emotionally distressed by the local rats. It's unclear how he knew this, possibly via squawking analysis. A dodo once reportedly followed a pig for 2 hours thinking it was leading it to a fruit tree. It wasn't. The pig was just lost. Some monks brought cats to Mauritius to control the rats, but the cats preferred sunbathing and judging everyone instead. The dodo that wasn't a dodo. You're wandering now through a room made of shadows and seawater memory. Not a jungle this time, but a museum, or something like it. Wooden floors creak beneath your steps. Glass cabinets line the walls, filled with bone sketches, and the kind of labels that try very hard to sound confident, but were probably written by someone squinting at a bird skeleton with a candle and a headache. In the center of the room stands a tall pedestal. On it sits a bird. Well, sort of. It has the beak of a hawk, the wings of a duck, the body of a large offended turkey, and legs like someone remembered chickens halfway through sculpting a cow. You stare at it. It stares back permanently because it's stuffed. And famously, not actually a dodo. Tonight's tale flutters gently into the realm of mistaken identity. How the legacy of the dodo got tangled up in bad taxidermy, confused reports, artistic exaggeration, and a few birds that weren't dodos at all, but ended up with the name anyway. Here's your historical fact, slightly fluffed and full of feathers that don't match many of the dodo remains displayed in European museums during the 17th, 19th centuries were either composites, poorly preserved, or outright fabrications. In some cases, curators filled in missing parts with wood chicken bones or creative guesswork. The goal? Make it look like something impressive. And what's more impressive than a bird that no one's seen in decades? You sit on a dusty bench. Across from you, a drawing of a dodo wearing a velvet collar looks deeply suspicious. In another case, a model dodo has glass eyes that follow you like it knows you once misspelled pigeon in a crossword puzzle. Most unsettling of all, some early naturalists used the name dodo to describe other extinct or unknown birds, particularly large flightless pigeons from nearby islands like Réunion or Rodrigues. Which leads us gently into tonight's peculiar twist. There was once an entirely separate bird called the white dodo of Réunion, which may not have been a dodo at all, but possibly a type of ibis or a fabricated sailor's tail altogether. Imagine a centuries-long case of mistaken identity played out in formal Latin and very stern museum voices. Now let's drift into tonight's scholarly fog. Can we ever really be sure what the true dodo looked like? Our most famous reconstructions come not from preserved bodies, but from paintings and bones. Paintings often done from memory, and bones rarely found fully intact. Some researchers argue that we've spent centuries chasing a bird that may have looked completely different from what we imagine today. That the round, cartoonish version we know is more myth than zoology. You walk closer to the pedestal. The label reads Dodo rhaphes cucullatus. Below it, in smaller print, specimen reconstructed in 1847 using partial remains, artistic references, and one goose leg. You blink. So does the dodo. Sort of. And in that moment, something settles. The dodo was never just a bird. It was a canvas. Painted by sailors. Rebuilt by scientists. Dressed up by illustrators. Misremembered by poets. It became more than a creature. It became a story. One that changed every time someone told it. Back in the forest of your mind, a real dodo waddles through fallen leaves. It doesn't care about labels. It doesn't know it's been reassembled in 10 different countries using spare parts. It only wants a fig and a patch of sun. The museum grows quiet. The glass reflects your face and the face of the not quite a dodo behind it. Both watching, both wondering. And before you fade into the warm hush of sleep, here are your 3 mismatched curiosities. One early taxidermist made a dodo model using swan feathers dyed gray, then claimed it was the most accurate dodo in Christendom. It later collapsed during a thunderstorm. A preserved foot, labeled dodo, in a Paris museum, was later found to be part of a cassowary. The curator quietly switched the sign to say cousin of the dodo. A Victorian artist painted a family of dodos having a picnic under a tree. The caption read, Sunday afternoon in Eden. Historically accurate, not even slightly. Adorable, absolutely. Bones in cabinets. Truth in drawers. You're in a dim hallway now, where the scent of dust and lemon oil hangs like a library ghost. Wooden drawers line the walls, dozens of them, each one labeled with delicate hand-lettered signs like specimen du Mazen 3B, partial tibia unknown, and one dramatically titled, Do Not Touch. Important. You're in the back room of a natural history museum, the kind of place where time settles into corners and bones wait patiently to be noticed. Tonight's tale slides open with the quiet scrape of a cabinet, the strange and fragmented afterlife of the dodo. Because once the last dodo was gone, vanished from Mauritius sometime around the late 1600s, it didn't really disappear. Not entirely. Its bones lingered, scattered, misplaced, labeled badly, rediscovered, forgotten again. The history of dodo remains is in many ways just as confusing and accidental as the bird's extinction itself. Here's your historical fact for tonight. Rattling gently on a shelf, for over 2 centuries, museums across Europe held dodo bones that were either misclassified, misassembled, or completely misunderstood. The only known soft tissue specimen, a dried dodo head and foot, sat in the Oxford University Museum, largely ignored for decades. It was at one point stored in a drawer labeled miscellaneous bird parts. Truly an honor. You're kneeling now beside a long oak cabinet. Inside fragments of femurs, part of a beak, and something that might be a pelvis or possibly a fossilized soup ladle. You can almost hear the whispers of scientists from the 1800s arguing softly over tea. That's a wing. That's a tailbone. That's definitely a mistake. Here comes tonight's peculiar little truth. Many early attempts to reconstruct the dodo's skeleton used bones from multiple individuals, sometimes multiple species. This led to some wildly imaginative displays. One famous case featured a dodo with a curved spine and giraffe-length legs. Another had a neck so long it looked like a bird trying to sneak into a snake convention. And now, we gently slide into tonight's scholarly kerfuffle. Does our modern understanding of the dodo rely more on fiction than fact? Some paleontologists argue that even now, we're still guessing. Sure, we've found better skeletons, especially after the 19th century discovery of the Mare aux Singes bone bed in Mauritius. But the image we hold in our heads, that plump, slightly smug-looking bird with the big hooked beak, it's partly science and partly artistic momentum that no one wanted to interrupt. You glance into another drawer. Inside, a note from 1855 that reads, "Bone of great interest, found near old sugar crate." The bone in question is stubby chipped and covered in handwriting. Next to it, a sketch of a dodo with a monocle and walking cane. Was it a joke? A mistake? A bored intern with a pencil and too much imagination? The answer doesn't really matter, because even in fragments, the dodo tells a full story. Not just of extinction, but of reconstruction, of curiosity, of people across centuries trying to piece together something they never truly understood in the first place. You sit back on a small stool. It creaks in agreement. Around you, the drawers close themselves in your imagination, one by one, each carrying a little piece of something that once waddled through sunlight, unafraid of pigs, rats, or paperwork. And just before your own bones settle into sleep, here are tonight's 3 misfiled footnotes. One curator accidentally glued a dodo foot to a duck skull, creating the infamous doduck, which was briefly exhibited before someone asked too many questions. A drawer labeled Extinct Avian Vertebrae was once found to contain nothing but 47 mismatched marbles and a spoon. A Dutch museum proudly displayed a complete dodo beak for decades, until it was discovered to be a decorative handle from a 17th century teapot. imaginary friend of naturalists. You're seated now in a quiet study lit by flickering candlelight and the soft scratching of a quill. Books are stacked in precarious towers, some open, some dusty, all brimming with ideas far too big for the shelves that hold them. A stuffed owl perches on a wooden globe, looking permanently skeptical. And on the desk before you, pinned delicately to a velvet mat, is a drawing of a bird. Round, noble, slightly confused. It's labeled Raphis cucullatus, the dodo, and yet it might not be. Tonight's story tiptoes through the minds of 18th and 19th century naturalists, those curious, slightly sleep-deprived thinkers who tried earnestly, beautifully, and often inaccurately to bring the dodo back to life on the page, not in reality, just in thought, in ink, in elegant Latin phrases wrapped around wild guesses. Here's your historical fact, written in looping calligraphy and coffee stains. For nearly 200 years after the dodo's extinction, naturalists debated what it looked like, how it behaved, and even if it was real, all without seeing a living specimen. You lean forward and examine one particularly dramatic sketch. The dodo is perched majestically on a cliff, gazing into the distance like it's pondering poetry. The background features waterfalls, possibly imaginary trees, and what appears to be a small castle. In real life, dodos lived on flat islands and probably tripped over coconuts, but no one told this artist. Which brings us to tonight's wonderfully peculiar detail. The dodo became a blank canvas for scientific longing. Naturalists who missed the chance to see it alive tried to reconstruct it from fragments, rumors, and their own personal opinions about what a dignified, extinct bird should look like. Some gave it long legs, others a puffed chest. One even painted it with a monocle and walking stick, possibly metaphorical, possibly wishful thinking. You imagine now one of these naturalists hunched over his desk, muttering Latin phrases between spoonfuls of cold porridge. He hasn't seen a dodo, but he feels like he understands it. He's named its bones. He's given it a personality. In his letters, he refers to the dodo as dear creature and our feathered mystery. He writes, it must have been solemn, perhaps philosophical. Another writes, surely it wept when the ships came. There's no proof of this, but you don't interrupt him. You're too charmed. And now gently, we drift into tonight's scholarly cuddle fight. Was the naturalist's version of the dodo a reconstruction or a creation? Some scholars argue these imagined portrayals helped keep the bird in public memory. Others believe they obscured real biology with romanticism. In either case, the dodo was no longer just a bird. It was an idea. You're curled now in a large armchair near the fire. The room smells like parchment pipe smoke and slightly moldy leather. A clock ticks softly in the background. The dodo drawing above the mantel stares down, eyes gleaming with permanent invented wisdom. And you feel it, that strange warmth that comes from knowing a creature lived, was loved, misunderstood, and still mattered anyway. It had no idea that people would argue over its proportions for centuries, that its roundness would inspire poems, that naturalists would daydream it into myth. It just wanted fruit and naps. And now, before your own thoughts drift off into soft parchment dreams, here are your 3 gently imagined footnotes. A London scholar once claimed dodos were musical and tried to compose a waltz in their honor, titled Dance of the Honking Philosopher. It was never performed. One Victorian collector swore he owned a genuine dodo egg, which was later revealed to be a painted coconut with a crack in it. A French naturalist tried to model a dodo's gait using a stuffed turkey on wheels. The result was described as emotionally upsetting. The Victorian Dodo Revival Craze. You're stepping into a sitting room now, where the wallpaper is floral, the teacups are unnecessarily fragile, and there's an overwhelming sense that everything here smells faintly of lavender and unresolved ambition. A fireplace crackles gently. Above it hangs a painting of a dodo well-fed, thoughtfully posed, and wearing a sash that reads, "Extinct but distinguished." Welcome to the 19th century, friend. The dodo is having a comeback. Tonight's chapter unfolds in lace porcelain and polite excitement how the Victorians, those passionate collectors of fossils, beetles, and peculiar feelings, fell head over button boots for the long-lost dodo. Here's your historical fact tonight, wrapped in tea steam and softly scandalized parlor talk. The Victorian era sparked a revival of interest in the dodo, not just among scientists, but among the general public, thanks to a heady mix of natural history, colonial nostalgia, and literary magic. The bird had been extinct for over 200 years, but suddenly it was everywhere in poetry, paintings, biscuit tins, and armchairs. Yes, armchairs. Upholstered with dodo-patterned fabric. Don't ask how they knew what the fabric should look like. That was not the point. You settle beside a velvet chaise lounge. A woman in a corset and aggressive feathered hat is reading aloud, from The Gentlewoman's Guide to Vanished Birds. A mustached gentleman nods solemnly and adjusts his monocle. They are both admiring a print of a dodo newly arrived from a catalog that also sells umbrellas shaped like swans. And here's your peculiar detail of the night Victorian illustrators took vast liberties when portraying the dodo. They made it taller, rounder sometimes, more human-like. One particularly bold piece shows a dodo sipping tea at a garden party beside a lemur in a bonnet. It was the golden age of close enough. Then came Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. You know the one. Charles Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, included a dodo as one of the central characters in the book's nonsensical dreamlike world. And while he probably chose the dodo as a humorous self-portrait, he stuttered, and Doo-Doo Dodgson became a nickname. The effect on the bird's legacy was massive. Suddenly, the dodo wasn't just extinct, it was iconic. Which floats us gently into tonight's scholarly tug-of-glove. Did the Victorians rescue the dodo from obscurity or distort it beyond recognition? Some historians say their romanticism kept the bird alive in cultural memory, fossilizing it in tea-stained adoration. Others argue that their version had little to do with the real creature, and more to do with what they wanted it to be: gentle, quaint, comically tragic. Like a faded photograph of a childhood no one quite remembers. You're paging through a dodo-themed children's book now. The dodo wears glasses and teaches spelling to hedgehogs. On the next page, he helps a knight find his keys. There's no scientific merit here, but the heart, it's in the right place. And you wonder, did the real dodo ever feel this admired? Probably not. But there's something oddly comforting about a creature that vanished in silence, returning as a symbol in crinolines and verse. Outside, a carriage rumbles by. Inside, the dodo tea set is being arranged carefully by a maid with opinions about bird anatomy. You overhear one guest mutter, "I do hope the dodo makes a fashionable return," as if extinction were a trend with seasonal potential. The room grows warmer. The fire glows golden. And you begin to understand something. The dodo round and vanished as it became a mirror. People saw what they needed in it, whether that was comedy tragedy or a bird who just wanted peace and a plum. And now, as your thoughts settle onto a velvet cushion of sleep, here are your 3 quaint giggles to drift on. A dodo-themed tea room opened briefly in London in 1879, featuring scones shaped like tiny eggs and waiters in beaked masks. It closed after 3 weeks due to excessive whimsy. One fashionable ladies' club ordered a set of silverware engraved with dodos. The knives, for reasons no one explained, were shaped like bananas. A poet named Percival Green dedicated 14 sonnets to the dodo. The final one was written entirely from the perspective of the dodo's left foot. Alice's Dodo and Literary Immortality. You find yourself now drifting through the pages of a dream, a paper dream bound in red leather and sprinkled with illustrations of smiling cats, anxious rabbits, and tea parties that never end on time. Somewhere in the corner of this wonderland, beneath a curling banner that reads Caucus Race Participants, stands a familiar shape. Round, beaked, slightly flustered. It's the dodo, and somehow it has found its way into literary immortality. Tonight's tale floats gently between nonsense and nostalgia. How one book, about a girl named Alice, ensured that the dodo would never truly disappear. Here's your historical fact, tucked behind a pun and a pocket watch. When Lewis Carroll published Alice's Adventures in Wonderland in 1865, he included a dodo as one of the main animal characters, and it became one of the earliest and most enduring pop culture versions of the bird. Now, if you squint at the name dodo, you'll find a little mischief. Carroll's real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, and as we sleepily noted in the last chapter, he had a stammer. When introducing himself, he often pronounced it as Doo-Doo Dodgson. So naturally, in the surreal playground of Wonderland, he turned that into a character. You're now seated at a long table under a tree where the leaves are made of footnotes and the teacups refill themselves without ever improving the tea. The dodo stands at the head of the table, attempting to explain the rules of a caucus race. Everyone must run in circles, and everyone wins. No one understands it, but no one questions it either. And that truly is the dodo's finest hour, a creature so deeply absurd that it fit perfectly in a world where logic took a nap. Here's tonight's peculiar detail. After Alice became a literary sensation, artists and publishers across Europe began inserting the dodo into illustrations, poems, even advertisements, often not because they knew much about the bird, but because it had become recognizable. The dodo became a symbol of whimsical confusion, the patron saint of friendly weirdness. It sold chocolates. It recommended trousers. One theater even staged a comedy titled The Dodo's Lament, though reviews suggest it was mostly just hats and misunderstandings. You turn a page, and there it is again. The dodo sketched in soft ink lines pointing with a wing at a snail in a bonnet. The caption reads, "He knew exactly what to do, but not quite when to do it." And here we arrive at tonight's scholarly cloud of gentle disagreement. Did the dodo in Alice cement a myth that overwhelmed its real history? Some argue that Carroll's version made it impossible to take the bird seriously again. It became a joke, a punchline. Others suggest that by giving the dodo a role, any role, it gave it permanence. It became part of culture, not just a species lost to time, but a voice in a story read for generations. You lean against a tree made of footnotes. The air smells faintly of ink, dusty velvet, and strawberry jam. The dodo beside you nods once, then waddles off to referee a chess match between a turtle and a spoon. You smile, because in this world, nothing has to make sense. And that makes perfect sense. The real dodo never wore a vest, never hosted races, never taught Alice the value of circular democracy. But in being remembered, even wrongly, it lived on. You close the book softly. The story isn't over. Not yet. And before your thoughts flutter away on a breeze of nonsense, here are your 3 literary giggles for the night. A 19th century playwright once insisted the Dodo in Alice was based on his uncle, who was round, opinionated, and unclear about directions. One early illustrated edition of Alice accidentally gave the Dodo eyebrows, angry ones. It was quietly corrected after a reviewer said it looked too French. There's a forgotten sequel called The Dodo's Debate, in which the bird tries to explain parliamentary procedure to a squirrel. It did not sell well. The bird that became a symbol. You're standing in a quiet gallery now, walls painted the kind of soft gray that makes everything feel like a memory. Light filters through high windows, catching the curves of sculpture, the brush strokes of old paintings, and one particular image that seems to follow you no matter where you walk. It's a dodo, not photorealistic, not even anatomically correct, just iconic. Round body, big beak, short wings, a kind of tragic confidence in its stance. The plaque beneath it reads, "Extinction as Identity." Tonight you're visiting the part of the dodo story that has nothing to do with meat bones or sailors with bad maps. This is about what the dodo came to represent long after it was gone. Here's your historical fact. Framed in gilded irony, the dodo became one of the world's first universally recognized symbols of human-driven extinction. It vanished not with thunder or battle, but with a whimper of negligence, and in doing so, it became the case study, the canary, in the global coal mine of vanishing species. You sit on a cushioned bench. Across the room, someone's sketching the painting eyes, flicking between canvas and notebook. They're not drawing it as a joke. Not this time. This dodo is not silly. It's solemn, reflective, a reminder. And now comes your peculiar little fact. For tonight, the phrase "as dead as a dodo" entered the English language by the late 18th century, becoming shorthand for something irretrievably gone, often used with an odd kind of smirk. A failed project, dead as a dodo. A political career, dead as a dodo. Your houseplant after vacation. You already know. It's a punchline, but also a tombstone. And here we slide gently into tonight's scholarly side-eye exchange. Did the dodo's legacy, as a symbol of extinction, help or hurt efforts to understand it as a living, breathing animal? Some historians say it dehumanized or debirded the species, turning it into a cautionary tale more than a real creature. Others argue that symbols have power, that without that symbolic weight, the dodo might have vanished not just from forests, but from thought entirely. You look up. Above you, a banner hangs in subtle script, "What we lose when we laugh too soon." Beneath it, a timeline. Dodo 1681, Great Auk 1844, Passenger Pigeon 1914. The years move closer, the list grows longer, and in the middle that bird again. What's strange is how versatile the dodo has become. It's used to sell ice cream, to warn about climate change. It's in cartoons, school books, memes, and museum logos. It's simultaneously funny, sad, naive, noble. A shape-shifting mascot of memory, and yet it never asked for that. It didn't design its extinction. It didn't volunteer to be a metaphor. It just lived, ate fruit, sat down when tired, honked occasionally. You glance at your reflection in the museum glass. The dodo beside you, painted, sculpted, printed, doesn't flinch. And somehow, it feels like it's watching you more than you're watching it. Because that's the real trick, isn't it? The dodo, isn't just a symbol of itself. It's a reflection of us, our curiosity, our carelessness, our urge to collect, consume, forget, remember. And that's a heavy legacy for a bird that couldn't even fly. The lights dim a little. The exhibit whispers, good night. And as your thoughts start to fold, like museum maps in gentle pockets of sleep, here are your 3 thoughtful giggles for the night. A British newspaper once ran the headline, "Government Budget as Dead as a Dodo," which resulted in several confused letters asking if the bird had returned to politics. A cereal brand used the dodo as a mascot in the 1960s. It was discontinued after kids reportedly felt bad eating breakfast with it. A dodo statue in a botanical garden was accidentally installed backward. No one noticed for 7 years, except one child who declared it very shy. Could the dodo come back? You're standing in a sleek, sterile laboratory now. Everything smells like chilled air, latex gloves, and overfunded ambition. There are glass vials lined up like tiny test tube soldiers, a whiteboard filled with arrows and hopeful equations, and on a glowing screen near the corner, a 3D model of a dodo. Not a painting, not a cartoon, not a museum replica with chicken legs and artistic optimism. This one breathes, blinks, bobs its head slightly as if trying to remember where it left its mango. Tonight you're stepping into the hush of a different kind of dream, the dream of bringing the dodo back. Here's your historical fact, not from centuries past, but from the current edge of science. In recent years, geneticists have begun exploring the possibility of de-extinction using DNA from preserved dodo remains to recreate something very close to the original bird. That's right. The dodo might not stay extinct forever. You sit beside a humming computer station. The screens flash images of chromosomes, pigeon embryos, and occasionally a confused-looking intern. In a small refrigerated case nearby rests a sliver of dodo DNA extracted from a museum specimen that for most of its life sat under glass, being pointed at by tourists with sticky fingers. Now let's slide gently into your peculiar detail. For tonight, the dodo's closest living relative is the Nicobar pigeon, a beautifully iridescent bird that looks like a disco party with wings. Scientists believe that by modifying the DNA of this still-living cousin, they might one day re-engineer a dodo-like bird. Not a perfect clone, but something feathered, something real, something waddly. Which brings us to tonight's glowing petri dish of scholarly dispute. Should we bring back the dodo at all? Some researchers say yes. It could serve as a symbol of redemption, a lesson in restoration, a way to undo a mistake made in ignorance. Others warn it's a distraction, a vanity project, a risk. Where would the new dodo live? Would it survive? Would it even be a dodo, or just a feathered Frankenstein shaped more by hope than history? You lean back in your chair. The lab ceiling is high and white and full of quiet hums. Somewhere behind you, a hologram of a dodo walks in circles, bumping gently into an invisible wall. It doesn't honk, but somehow you think it might eventually. And what would a new dodo mean? Would it remember the forests it never lived in? Would it feel at home in Mauritius, where its great-great-grandfather was last seen dodging a goat? Or would it live in an enclosure, studied, filmed, endlessly labeled as the bird we lost, but maybe not quite? You picture the first of its kind hatching, tiny, soft, blinking into a world of climate change, smartphones, and dodo-shaped novelty mugs. What would it think of us? Would it forgive you? Close your eyes. The hum of machines becomes the buzz of forest insects. The fluorescent lights blur into soft tropical sun. You're no longer in a lab. You're back beneath the trees in that quiet green world where dodos once blinked, waddled, and pecked at fruit with no knowledge of science or extinction or philosophical implications. Just hunger, shade, and the deep calm knowledge that everything was okay until it wasn't. And now, as sleep begins to engineer its own gentle transformation, here are your 3 drowsy giggles to stitch into your dreams. One tech billionaire reportedly offered to fund dodo de-extinction in exchange for naming rights. He suggested Dodo 2.0, the return. Negotiations did not proceed. A speculative children's book titled If You Give a Dodo a Drone briefly trended online, featuring scenes of a reborn dodo ruining a wedding. A zoologist once asked, "If the dodo comes back, what will it teach us?" And a colleague replied, "To unplug the ship before we dock." Why we're still wrong about dodos. You're in a classroom now, but not the stressful kind with pop quizzes and squeaky chalk. This one has soft chairs, open windows, and the faint smell of old books and tropical flowers. A large poster on the wall features a cartoonish dodo with crossed eyes and a sign that reads, "Extinct, clueless, and proud." Somewhere, a dodo plushie lies belly up on the teacher's desk, holding a half-eaten apple like it passed out mid-snack. Tonight's story gently taps you on the shoulder to remind you we're still getting the dodo wrong. Despite all the paintings, poems, documentaries, teacups, and commemorative stamps, much of what people know about the dodo is about as scientifically accurate as a map drawn by a tipsy pirate. We've turned the bird into a feathered punchline, lazy dumb, somehow deserving its fate. Here's your historical fact scribbled on a napkin beside a plate of mango slices. Modern research shows that the dodo was not stupid, not slow, and definitely not nature's mistake. It was well adapted to its environment. It just wasn't adapted to ours. You flip open a well-loved textbook. Chapter title, Common Misconceptions About the Dodo. Subheadings include, "No, it wasn't a fat chicken. Yes, it could run, and please stop saying it deserved extinction." And here's your peculiar detail. For the night, the dodo had a relatively large brain for its body size, especially in areas related to smell and movement. That's right. It could sniff out food and navigate its terrain quite capably. If it walked up to sailors, it wasn't because it was dim-witted, it's because it didn't know humans were dangerous. Honestly, some of us still don't. You move to the next part of the room, where a timeline stretches across the wall. On it misquotes bad illustrations and one delightful 18th century pamphlet titled, "A Study of the Bird Who Looketh Foolish." A footnote reveals the author had never left mainland Europe and once misidentified a turkey as a French diplomat. And here's tonight's scholarly shoulder shrug. Why do we keep clinging to the myth of the dumb dodo? Some say it helps us feel better. If the dodo was too stupid to live, then maybe we didn't really mess up by letting it vanish. Others suggest it's just easier to tell a funny story than a sad one. Tragedy makes us uncomfortable. Jokes let us look away. You step back. In the center of the room now stands a life-sized model of a dodo realistically shaped, feathered with care, standing alert. Not cartoonish, not pathetic, just present. The plaque below it reads, "I was never dumb. I was just trusting." The model looks you in the eye. You blink first, and you start to wonder If we could rewrite the story we've told about this bird, would we? Would we teach children that it was curious, not clueless, that it ran when it had to, that it was the product of peace, not a victim of failure? Would we call it extinct or simply unfinished? The window lets in a breeze, now warm and laced with the imagined scent of sea air and guava. You sit in one of the soft chairs. The plush dodo is still holding its apple, now slightly squished. It's hard not to like it. Even harder not to feel a little guilty about the myths we wrapped it in. And as your eyes grow heavier than a pigeon on a lazy afternoon, here are your 3 thoughtful nods disguised as giggles. A biology teacher once gave a pop quiz with only one question. Was the dodo dumb? Half the class wrote yes. The other half passed. A children's toy company made a dodo that played music when squeezed. The tune, "Oops, I Did It Again." Some messages are too on the nose. A satirical magazine listed top 10 things smarter than the dodo and accidentally included a turnip twice. The editor later apologized to the turnip. The artist's imaginary bird. You're now standing in a painter's studio, a cozy chaos of canvases, open windows, and the quiet scent of turpentine mixed with fruit peels. Afternoon light spills across the floor like melted gold, and in the middle of it all stands a half-finished painting of a dodo. Except it isn't quite a dodo. Not really. It's a little too upright. The feathers shimmer in shades no dodo ever wore. Its beak curves with suspicious elegance, like it just told a secret it swore it wouldn't. There's even a tiny crown resting slightly off-center on its head. Yes, friend, you've entered the world of artistic liberties. Tonight's tale peels back the curtain on one of the oddest truths of all. Most people's image of the dodo comes not from science, but from centuries of art made by people who had never seen the real thing. Here's your historical fact, still wet with metaphorical paint. Only a handful of sketches of living dodos exist, and they were drawn in the 1600s by sailors and amateur naturalists, some of whom had all the observational accuracy of someone describing a bird after a bottle of rum. The rest reconstructed from bones, secondhand stories, and the powerful human urge to fill in the gaps with flair. You stroll past a row of illustrations now. One shows a sleek, muscular dodo charging through jungle undergrowth like a feathered gladiator. Another depicts a dainty creature holding a parasol, eyes half-lidded in vague aristocratic boredom. And then there's the dramatic oil painting, a noble dodo in profile, backlit by a tropical sunset, as though it's about to deliver a soliloquy to the ocean. It's beautiful. It's moving. It's also completely made up. And now comes tonight's peculiar detail. Some artists, particularly in the Victorian era, used chicken feet, parrot wings, and duck torsos to reconstruct their vision of the dodo. The result? Birds that look like oversized canaries on a mission, or very sleepy turkeys wearing oven mitts. Let's ease now into tonight's soft, scholarly smudge. Is it better to have an inaccurate image than no image at all? Some argue that these wildly imaginative depictions helped the dodo become unforgettable, even if they weren't real. Others say they distracted from actual science, turning the bird into a caricature so charming no one questioned whether it was true. You pause before one particularly bold painting. The dodo is flying. Yes, flying. Wings extended, soaring over waves, eyes alight with purpose. A small caption beneath reads, "What if you can't help but smile?" Maybe it never flew. Maybe it couldn't run all that fast. Maybe it honked in confusion more than it ever called in pride. But the dodo in these paintings lives the life it was denied, dramatic, adored, eternal. And perhaps, just perhaps, that's a kind of justice. Because in being imagined, reimagined, and hilariously misimagined, the dodo became something rare, a creature not just remembered, but reinvented by every generation that missed it. It left behind more than bones. It left behind stories. And now, as you settle beside an unfinished canvas, brushes quiet sky, deepening outside the window, here are your 3 painted giggles to send you softly into slumber. One French illustrator in 1802 gave the dodo eyebrows, suspenders, and a pipe, claiming it helped convey wisdom. He was politely asked to paint fruit instead. The museum once displayed a dodo sculpture with 6 wings, 2 tails, and sandals. It turned out to be fan art submitted by a school. The oldest surviving dodo sketch includes a note from the artist, uncooperative model, kept eating my lunch. Echoes in the forests of Mauritius. You're walking through a forest now, but not the one from centuries ago. This one still hums with life, but it's quieter, gentler. Like the island is remembering something it can't quite say out loud. The path beneath your feet is lined with cinnamon-colored earth and fallen leaves. Sunlight filters through the canopy in sleepy columns. Every now and then, a branch creaks, not in warning, but in memory. You're in Mauritius, the dodo's homeland. And if you listen closely, really closely, you might just hear the echo of wings that never beat and footsteps that never ran. Tonight's story returns us to the island where it all began, and where despite the silence, the dodo never truly left. Here's your historical fact carried on the wind between banyan trees. Although the dodo is extinct, Mauritius still bears its mark in its place, names, oral traditions, conservation efforts, and even its national identity. The bird is everywhere, on coins, on stamps, on murals, on logos for airlines, eco-lodges, and cricket teams, and occasionally in the hearts of the people who grew up with stories of the bird that was once theirs. You pause beside a moss-covered rock. It's not marked, not fenced, but the guide who brought you here, quiet barefoot, with a voice like low thunder, says this spot is known as the last nest. No one knows for sure, of course, but legends grow in the gaps. History leaves behind. Nearby children play. One of them is whistling, not a song you know, but something soft and circular, the kind of tune that sounds like it's been passed down for too long to remember who started it. Here's your peculiar detail for the night. Some locals still refer to certain forest clearings as dodo gardens, not because the birds planted anything, but because the space feels watched, familiar, like a place that once belonged to someone who hasn't come home in a long time. It's not superstition, it's reverence. And now gently, we step into tonight's scholarly hush. How should a place remember a creature that vanished from it? Some argue for reconstruction. Plaques, statues, DNA revival projects. Others believe memory is enough, that to walk through the forest and feel something missing is more powerful than seeing it rebuilt. You reach a clearing. It smells of guava and damp bark. In the middle is a sculpture, simple rounded, carved from wood, worn smooth by wind and time. It's not labeled. It doesn't need to be. Someone has left a mango at its base, fresh, unbitten, a silent offering. And in that moment, the forest does something small. It exhales. Not as if letting go, but as if continuing. Because the dodo isn't just a story of extinction, it's a story of presence. of something that lived so fully in its place that even after it was gone, the place remembered. The island still hums with dodo-shaped gaps, and you, for a brief and gentle moment, get to stand in one. And before you fade into the quiet rustle of forest dreams, here are your 3 echoes of feathered laughter. A Mauritian shopkeeper once carved 100 wooden dodos for tourists, only to have locals buy them all and refuse to sell them back. They were too good, someone explained. A conservationist tried playing recordings of pigeon coos in the forest to test for ancestral memory. The only response, a gecko that looked mildly offended. One school's mascot is a dodo in sunglasses named Dede. Their motto, too cool to fly. A gentle endling. You're sitting at the edge of the world now, or at least it feels that way. A low cliff overlooks the ocean, where the waves roll in with the patience of centuries. The sky above is stretching into dusk, soft and lavender, and the air smells like salt wild thyme and the cooling hush of something old exhaling one last time. Tonight, we meet the dodo, not in flocks or in sketches, not in cabinets or poems, but as what it quietly became in Endling, the last of its kind. Here's your final historical fact. Gentle as the tide, no one recorded the exact day the last dodo died. There was no announcement, no ceremony. No one even knew it was the last. A bird walked somewhere in the forest, perhaps pecked at a fruit, blinked at the horizon, and then one day, it simply wasn't there. And so the species slipped away, not with drama, but with stillness. You're wrapped in a blanket, now perched on a smooth rock, as the stars begin to peek out one by one. You imagine that final dodo not as a tragic figure, but simply there, unaware that it carried the full weight of its kind on its back. Maybe it had a favorite tree. Maybe it slept curled up in moss. Maybe it made one last honk into the quiet, not knowing it wouldn't be answered. And here's your peculiar final detail. The dodo is one of the few extinct animals whose name has never fallen out of use. It's still said aloud, jokingly, fondly, thoughtfully. In classrooms, in stories, in wistful sighs. It's part of our vocabulary of loss, but also of wonder. Now comes one last gentle scholarly musing. Do we owe the dodo something more than memory? Not guilt. Not resurrection. But maybe a promise to notice more carefully. To tread more lightly. To recognize the strange and the slow. And the softly ridiculous as worthy of space. Of time. Of continuation. You lie back the stars overhead, now clear and humming with possibility. The ocean below reflects moonlight like it's painting in silver. Somewhere in the trees behind you, the leaves rustle not with footsteps, but with remembering. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. The dodo didn't fly. It didn't roar. It didn't dazzle. But it lived. And that's a legacy that refuses to vanish. Now, as sleep draws near, and your breath matches the rhythm of distant waves, here are your final 3 bedtime smiles. A scientist once said, if the dodo had just been a bit more suspicious, it might still be here. He was later bitten by a suspicious goose. There's a ship in New Zealand named the Dodo's Revenge. It only sails in circles, on purpose. One anonymous note found taped to a museum case read, "Dear Dodo, I would have left you alone." And so, friend, our journey with the dodo draws to a close. Not with a bang. Not with a grand finale. Just a soft hush. Like feathers settling. Like waves smoothing over footprints that were never meant to last. You've walked through forests of memory and dusted off the drawers of forgotten museums. You've met sailors who couldn't describe what they saw, poets who imagined more than they remembered, and scientists still trying to fit together the puzzle with half the pieces missing. But through it all, the dodo remained calm, curious, a little round, a little confused, and utterly beautifully itself. It lived in a world that didn't ask it to change. And when that world changed around it, the dodo stayed the same. That perhaps was its undoing, but also its charm. It didn't adapt. It didn't run. It trusted. It stayed. And somehow, by simply being it, became one of the most unforgettable creatures never seen again. So now, as your eyelids drift downward, like leaves caught in warm breeze, take a breath. Not a big one, just enough. Enough to remember that not all legends roar or conquer. Some just waddle through the underbrush, chasing fruit, blinking into the sun. May we all be remembered so kindly. That's the story for tonight. May your dreams be filled with wonder and peace.